Hi, welcome to the live weekly update. To the live weekly update on March 18th, 2026. I was just wondering, like, why am I doing these lives live? Would it be better if I just did like a video? If I'm just talking? Hi! No, because if I wasn't live, you wouldn't be able to join. um, but yeah, I've been thinking, like, it's weird to do these lives when it's just flow, unedited, freestyle. But I'm going to talk about that because this week, part of my process has been learning about, the process. And um, I have been deeply, deeply, deeply busy, focused on writing. And that's because I did a sermon over the weekend. Now, you might be surprised to know this is not my first sermon. It was my second, but both have occurred at Unitarian churches. And, that's what I was thinking. Okay. Did you hear this talk about, thank you for the comment on the sermon. I want to talk about it. It was a great experience. But I just got distracted because did you hear the talk about how Friday the 13th of 2026, maybe it was when we jumped timelines from Friday the 13th in March of 2020? Do you know what I'm talking about? I've been thinking about that and I was like, God, I hope so. I hope we've shifted timelines. But it's interesting that Friday the 13th of 2020 and 2026 coincided. And when I was thinking about the sermon, lo and behold, guess what? My first sermon at a Unitarian church was scheduled to happen that following Sunday, no lie, in California. But I canceled it because even though we weren't like fully in lockdown yet, I was like, I don't think this feels right to be traveling, knowing the congregation was going to be largely elderly folks. And so, yeah, I know, right? Like, I forgot about that, but I was thinking about it. I was like, I cannot believe it. So I ended up doing my first sermon for that Unitarian church in 2020, which was scheduled to be that weekend. That's like literally 6 years. I can't believe it. I ended up doing that one online and virtual instead. So it wasn't the same kind of experience, but wow, wowzers. And interestingly enough, I remember that the sermon that I actually gave online to the Unitarian congregation in California in 2020 was about love as like the practice of social justice, or that social justice needs to be rooted in love. So I was very much riffing on that idea that like justice is love in public, and trying to always emphasize the message that any kind of social justice action needs to be rooted in love. So 6 years later, without me even realizing it, on the following Sunday after the Friday the 13th, I'm at a Unitarian church giving a sermon about, now it wasn't exactly love. What I intended to do, and last week my live stream update, live weekly update, was on learning and love, and I want to revisit that. I've been so behind I haven't even been able to like publish it, but I was revisiting what I talked about last week, and at this time last week I was trying to write the sermon and really struggling, not gonna lie, really struggling through it, because I was given the prompt, like the theme that they asked me to speak on was on followership and being a good follower, and specifically being a good follower by following the lead of those who are most impacted first, in terms of like movement work. And so it was hard for me to get to like, how do I talk about good followership? And I know that I was like really struggling with the phrasing. It was like something wasn't clicking. So this time last week, Wednesday, I talked about learning as a way of like loving. And that was coming from a phrase that I often think about. It's in my coloring book, that learning looks like love in action. I think that there are strong parallels between like the experience of learning and my understanding of love as the will to extend oneself. So I was this time last week thinking about really emphasizing much more again that notion of love, which it really didn't come through so strongly in this sermon most recently, until the end, when I was referring to Alexis Pauline Gumb's book Undrowned, this one, lovely. And it just so happens that the chapter on collaborate, this is on page 57, the quote that I'm thinking of, ends with this, like, I mean, her writing's beautiful, but it ends with this, like, paragraph about learning with others, as in school, like a school of dolphins, how they move in proximity, taking turns, diving deep, and like that there's this ability to step forward or step back and fulfill one's role without having to prove anything to another person. And this whole phrasing, of course, is like, I love you and I have so much to learn. I love you and we are just now learning that it's possible. Love on a scale we can survive. I love you and how generous, how downright miraculous it is that life would let me learn like this. So the connection to loving through learning came through in my most recent survey by really echoing that passage from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, but I didn't emphasize loving the way that I anticipated I would when I talked about this last week. So it's interesting how that all happened, and I mean, I still feel the same way. I still feel like learning is a way of loving, and as I've been thinking about that, I want to go back a little bit to what happened last week, and I do have a plan, loosely. Look, I have notes today. Loose plan for what I want to talk about today to share, but I want to talk about the theme of like good followership. I really want to emphasize some other things that have been coming up in the past few weeks for me around leadership and liberatory leadership. And then a little bit more about what I'm learning about this whole process, since I'm kind of returning to the purpose of the live weekly update as being a particular section of the work that I'm trying to do. I think I'm reflecting on that because it's been a lot. I have been so busy, so disciplined and focused in my work lately that it has been nearly unmanageable. Like too much to do. And so part of that was preparing for the sermon that basically last Wednesday, struggling to write. I needed to have everything by Friday, and I didn't do it. But I was writing, like diligently trying to like beat my head into having some clarity of what I was going to say Thursday, Friday, into Saturday. And so then, I mean, it was intense. I had very late nights till like 2:30 in the morning. And I was like, this feels like grad school. Me writing like this. Okay, I'm just going to keep going on this. Hold on, since this is where I'm at. Here's something that I learned in the process of doing that. It felt like I was in graduate school. It felt like I was writing a final seminar paper because I was given a topic and I was like, how do I make sense of this? And it wasn't the same as what I usually do, which is like, I'm sharing what I'm most inspired by or what's like kind of top of mind for me in the moment as this section of my process. But I was given this topic and I had to try to figure out how to talk about it. And that's why things shifted once I finally got into it. But the writing itself was an interesting experience because I realized that like I'm sitting there trying to put together a thing I have to share, basically like a script. And that's very different for me. If you've been to any of my spaces, most of my like, I'm going to be on the microphone on the stage is I have an idea of where I'm going, but it's pretty extemporaneous. This was not one of those things that you could do like that. So once I got into that epiphany of realizing like, oh, I need to write this thing, then I realized I basically wrote almost a 10-page paper. And that's why it felt like a seminar paper. And I realized I haven't written a paper like that since graduate school. And so I was like painfully reminded of the process and the practice itself of trying to write my thoughts coherently. I do a lot of writing in my notebooks. I do my pages for the past couple of years has been where I've been like kind of pushing more of my creative externalization, like thoughts into words, but even that is still not the same. And so last week, well, there's a couple of connections here, but last week when I was talking about learning and learning as love and action, part of the emphasis was on like how important it is for us to know and learn how to read, write, think, speak, and listen clearly and critically. Um, and I really seriously mean it. Like, it was a sort of brutal reminder to me to be like, I don't write enough right now to feel super, like, in my own practice and disciplined ways of clearly and critically communicating my thoughts through writing. So that's why it felt like I was in graduate school. If you um, watch from last week's update, I was telling stories of the professor who sat me down and like did not let me get through the semester of my like independent study in graduate school, and I had to rewrite a paper 5 times because she was like, no, no, nope, 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 nope. And I learned so much through her high critique of my writing technique. But also even that experience of like, how come no one sat my ass down and showed me how to actually write? So I felt like I was back in graduate school with that schooling of like, you gotta write it out, like actually coherently. And it's a very different process of putting our thoughts together. It's an extremely different process of being able to articulate and like harness the impact and the power of our voice. And that was the theme also that I was talking about last week of like how to make your voice matter. I don't think everything needs to be written, but that is certainly a powerful way to do it. And I was reminded again of like, well, I mean, pretty much everybody that I learned from wrote stuff. So it was sort of a reality check for me to be like, I could really do more to write. And it was hard, not gonna lie. It was very difficult. And I think that's actually probably more of the reason why I want to do it more, or I'm feeling inclined to lean into that space more, because it felt significant. You know, like if you do like a really good workout and you really push yourself and you're like, okay, I accomplished something. I don't know exactly what, and it's not the thing alone in itself. Like, it doesn't end there, but I definitely did something. I can feel that effort. That's kind of how it felt after cramming to write this 10-page paper for this sermon, which I ended up not doing on the love explicitly again, but I titled Learning How We Move. And the whole emphasis of that was on learning itself and how we learn, who we learn from, what we learn, and then what we're willing to do in light of what we learn. Again, following the lead of those who are most impacted and trying to make sense of that. So to kind of bridge these 2 weeks together from last week and this week, now that I actually have written that sermon and had that experience, I wanted to revisit kind of the theme that I was introducing and do it in a little bit more of an explicit way, I think. I just want to circle back to last week where I was talking about learning and saying that, like, I love the question of what does it feel like to learn? How do you know when you are learning? And I like it because it's like, well, maybe we could be really like, naive, sort of clear beginner's mind of being like, how do you know when you're really loving? And what does it feel like to love? For that, I mean, the clarity that I've gotten around loving is coming from bell hooks. I talk about this all the time, and I think it's really helpful to have the definition, which I've adopted and kind of tweaked a little bit to say that love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's healing, transformation, or liberation. I rattle it off because I say it all the time. If you didn't get it, like, keep listening. I say it constantly. But the key part about that definition that I love, I mean, there are 3 main parts. But one that I really try to emphasize is that love is not just the will to extend oneself, though that's important. But I really like the point about for the purpose of, that we extend ourselves for a particular purpose. And that purpose is now also named for one or oneself or another's healing, transformation, and liberation. When I talk about learning, this is a similar kind of point of emphasis, that I don't say we need to learn for the sake of learning. Like, rarely is that really the point that I'm trying to make. But learning for a particular purpose is absolutely crucial and necessary. And so, obviously, I hope the purpose for our learning can be to know how to move in the world, how to be part of positive change, how to show up and do the thing that is our thing to do and be able to identify that and then get better at it and better at it and better at it. All of those are instances of learning with a particular purpose. And I do think that the purpose, let's just make it easy, can also be learning. Like almost definitionally this works. Learning as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's healing, transformation, or liberation. Otherwise, what are we learning? You might say like, well, we need to learn some really practical technical skills, and that doesn't seem so liberated or liberation focused. And honestly, I guess, but also not really, because in my mind, if we're learning so that we can be more effective within the collective, or say learning so that we can move more gracefully within the school of all other beings here, our neighbors and other animals and creatures and plants, like just being a part of the planet, if we can learn to move better, more gracefully, more balanced, in greater harmony, more sustainably, in ways that affirm life and don't threaten and destroy it, then whatever we're learning will also include the technical skills that we can do and employ in our own little role so that we can fulfill our duties in a way that serves the greater good without having to be the same as every other person in this school of movement. Why am I winking? I don't know. Did you get that? So yeah, I was like thinking about that today, of how, I don't know, I think there's something important about even asking the question, how do you know when you're learning, is kind of like how do you know what love really looks like or what it really feels like? And that purposefulness is always at the center, with a clear articulated purpose for liberation, to put it simply. Okay. I think I'm thinking right now of like other timelines that are jumping. I don't know. Maybe I won't get all weird about it. I will say that like I'm haunted right now by the astrology. I talk about Chani all the time, Chani Nicholas and the astrology too, because there's something else that's coming back around right now. Like today, March 18th, there's a new moon in Pisces, and this is supposed to be a big reset. And for someone like me who's Pisces rising, this is like a big deal or something. Well, in my sermon work, what I ended up doing was referring not just to Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, but also to The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And there was a very particular moment that happened in February 17th, if you recall. That was a major moment for everyone, but astrologically speaking, in terms of like the way the world moves, it was a new moon. Another new moon. It was Lunar New Year, and there was a full lunar eclipse on February 17th. It was like all happening all at the same time. It's also the beginning of Ramadan, and like a significant little spiritual, planetary, cosmological, astronomical moment. And that was also the time when I was like uncovering all those letters from high school and notebooks. I found documents and notebooks from college and graduate school. And I found my honker of a folder of the first drafts of the dissertation that I ended up never writing, all 6 chapters. And I also found my comprehensive exam notebook, what I studied in my comprehensive exams. And I think there's something so fascinating here, because I was haunted by the fact that I saw the questions I got in my comprehensive exams, and then my answers that I wrote on the weekend, which was an intensive part for any kind of graduate school experience, your comps. And I didn't have the nerve to go back and read my answers to my comprehensive exams, but I did read the questions. And one of the questions was, why is Foucault a preferred resource and thinker to talk about affect and embodiment rather than these 6 other figures? Engage with 2 of them, compare and contrast the 3. And one of those was Fanon. And I had a thought after that. I was like, why in grad school I did not talk about Fanon? And I'm like, maybe I didn't learn enough about his work back then to know it. And so ever since then, a month ago, I had this moment that was kind of throwing me back into my own learning in a like academic way, in a formal academic way, graduate study way, of being like, I don't think I learned enough about Fanon, even though I know I read the book and I read all this stuff, clearly, but why wasn't I engaging in it? And I don't know if I wasn't like confident enough to engage with his work on that question for my comp exam. That's probably what was going on. I was like, I don't want to speak to that because I don't know if I can do that clearly enough. But ever since then, this whole idea, like when I was like, why aren't we studying them? It's been a call to myself. So like, I'm always usually talking to myself when I'm sharing the process. And from that uncovering in February, the finding of these notebooks and letters, really like asked myself the question of like, well, I wonder what was going on back then when I didn't use Fanon in my answer for the comp exam. And I want to read again. Let me go back and revisit. So I've been working through The Wretched of the Earth again. And hence like why this became kind of a core inspiration for what I talked about in the sermon. Like I'm literally walking in the process to asking the questions, not to other people, but also to myself. So that's another interesting little like timeline leap that has played out, like feeling back to graduate school. Like I was writing this sermon, it felt like writing my comp exams again, writing a seminar paper, but then revisiting these questions. And that, I think there's something about learning there. This is like just kind of a little extra point. I wonder a lot about learning when we experience it. And I think for me, I know that one of the key things is that learning takes repetition and revisitation. Last week I was talking about like the loving eye and like how to love like an artist by just paying attention enough to perceive what is there with this openness, to be attuned, to like take in and pay attention. The loving perception versus the arrogant eye is part of like to love like a lesbian artist would love the woman that she's trying to paint. That's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But this process of kind of going back and revisiting, I think, is also an element of like not having the arrogance of thinking like, oh, I've already been there. I've already done that. I know what that is. It's why I revisit so many of the same works over and over and over again, because we change and we learn more in between those visitations, which then allows us to have a different kind of perception with it, which is also why I love astrology. Like, you can knock it all you want, but like if you're a self-reflective person, there's always this mirroring that can happen, which doesn't have to be about what Jupiter is doing so much as it is about what meaning we make of it. And that's part of being a good active learner, like to be engaged, willingly extending yourself to be in this process and participating in it. And you can do that not again to just be distracted or even like, I don't know if, I hope not, but maybe some people would be like, I don't read books. I like to think my own thoughts, as if this is somehow like a sign of weakness to be influenced or informed by other people. Why would that be the case? Not if we're critical, not if we're thinking in a way that is like actively part of our own project. And we don't like lose ourselves in it or conflate ourselves into whatever it is that we're learning. I think there's a lot there. The piece I didn't get to talk about in the sermon as much as I wanted to was actually about like how to not conflate what other people know with like who we are in the way that becomes appropriative. There was this theme that I really wanted to try to weave throughout about how to respectfully engage in other people's work when it's about an experience that's not your own. And I think this is crucial. But that's part of the loving experience too. We don't have to project our own things onto other people, which is kind of a form of domination. We also don't need to take it and consume it and like make it fit us. It's like putting on somebody else's skin, like a psychopath or something. Like that doesn't have to be the way that we learn either. And I think there's a crucial element there that I didn't get to emphasize as much as I wanted to, but it's definitely a topic worth continuing to explore, of how to learn from others about experiences that are not our own in a way that is respectful without appropriating and consuming those insights, but still making meaning of it in a way that becomes applicable for us and can inform the way that we move given the specificity of who we are and where we are located in the grand scheme of things. Okay, speaking of that, I want to talk about leadership now. Because the theme of the sermon was followership. I was asked to speak to what it means to be a good follower and following the lead of those who are most impacted. And basically, the point that I ended up like really driving home is that like choose who you're following based on not just like their status of being oppressed, but the insight that they have about knowing what it takes to get free for all of us, because we all need that. It lands differently, we're positioned differently, but the project of liberation and getting free is something that I believe everybody should be a part of, regardless of where you are in an artificial hierarchy of privilege and disadvantage. Now, I think that got confusing. This is a little side note I want to say. I think it got confusing for me when I was really struggling to write that, because following the lead of those who are most impacted is actually a really good strategy for how to organize and prioritize whose needs are met first. That I fully agree with. But responding to people's needs is different from following their lead if we take that to say, like, we're just listening for the command of what they say, because you will hear different things based on people, even if they have like shared group identities. And that can be really confusing. So that's why it's more values informed of like, is the leadership showing us how to get free? And regardless of what's going on, meeting people's needs can be a practice that we prioritize, like those who are most in need first is very different. So I had to actually separate that out in my mind to be able to make sense of how to do this sermon at all. Anyway, let's think about both of those things, like meeting the needs of the most impacted first, and then also knowing what it takes to get free. I will say right now I'm kind of balancing. I'm not gonna say I was like maxed out. It's because I'm balancing at least 4, if not more, major projects at the moment that all piled on at the same time, kind of unexpectedly. One of them was the sermon, and that took a lot. But I'm so grateful, so incredibly grateful for the opportunity. And I learned so much from it. I will keep bringing this in because there's a lot to share there. But the other thing that has been a massive lift for the past few weeks is that I'm involved again in a committee that is doing grant making within the state of Colorado for a very special fund. I've talked about this fund before, but this is a fund that is geared towards supporting the liberatory leadership of women and girls and gender expansive people of color throughout our state. Now, let me just say that this has been a 3-week process of going through applications, doing my own notes. Everybody on the committee had to do that. And then there were scheduled interviews to talk with the grantees who applied. And that took weeks, like 2 weeks, but it was like so intense. And I didn't have to be on all of them, but some people were, like the manager for this whole process definitely was. And what an amazing, incredible commitment and super heavy lift to make space to have room for everybody to talk. But a key thing about this fund that I love, and what has been so wonderful about being on this committee again and having this experience, is that you are literally reading hundreds of pages from dozens and dozens of organizations who have leaders who are doing incredible work throughout the state, and very much exemplifying what it means to meet the needs who are those who are most impacted first. We've added on this other level of like, we know direct service is important. Like meeting people's basic needs is absolutely necessary. That's grassroots organizing, that is mutual aid, that is like networks of care, that is really like truly organizing with each other to take care of each other and keep each other safe. Yes, all of that matters. And then in these applications, in this process, there's this explicit emphasis on, do the folks who are doing this work have a sense for liberatory leadership, because we want to be investing more resources and have like a vote of confidence to keep going in those who have a liberatory approach to the way that they do their work. And that, I know this fund is now 6 years old, and over those 6 years, another timeline jump, over those 6 years, this point I feel like is tricky. It was probably a little like premature in our general shared understanding of what could be gleaned from the phrase liberatory leadership back in 2020. But now I hope that there's like a little bit more substance behind what that looks like. And I'll just say that like liberatory leadership to me is really about how people embody the values of liberation in their practices, in how they pursue their projects and lead others. The thing about like the followership conversation that was interesting is that, it implies leaders. Some people would say you're not a leader unless you have followers, and maybe you're not a follower unless you're following the lead of someone. But so these two like processes that were going on for me simultaneously of thinking about good followership while also being for 3 weeks just inundated with reviewing applications and being in conversations and listening to people talk about their work through the lens of liberatory leadership was really a lot. And beautiful, like so incredible. So one thing that I want to take away from that is that like whether it's the following the lead of those who know what it takes to get free and then organizing to meet the needs of those who are most impacted first. The sermon was titled like learning how we move, because it's always about like being able to move together. And what I pulled from Undrowned, why I liked the pieces from that book, was that the school of like striped dolphins as a metaphor and a reality shows that there's like this, by being in attunement with each other, we can actually learn too. So like that's what's like how miraculous it is that life will let me learn like this. So it's this organic process of being in that kind of fluid relationship and becoming attuned to each other that we learn how to move. And then there was also the part of like study what the people who know what it takes to get free will say, and to give you like some real material to work with here. But in that, like the liberatory leadership is also about like how we move to embody the practices and the values of liberation in the way you lead. You can be a very effective leader and sort of embody, I don't know, more traditional, conventional ways of doing that if all you're focused on is the goal, the outcome, the ends. And I think that one of the key things about doing really great liberatory work, really great equity work, I've always said this too, is that it's about the means and the ends, not just the end itself. Like the means or our methods, our practices, the how we go about doing something is really critical for the integrity of the outcomes themselves. So, in like my coloring book, for instance, the very first page is liberation is the ground, the goal, and the guide. That means it's like where we start from in terms of like what we take is like critical. The goal is our vision, our end that we're pursuing, and the guide is the how of what we do and how we do it. So this notion of like liberatory leadership, I think, is really critical because it's asking us to pay attention to how we go about doing our work in a way that somehow is rooted in an awareness of that, like, to become different, we have to move differently, or we can be different to produce something radically different, which is our ultimate like vision. I mean that you could just be like done, period. Yes, that's the point. But for me, in the like 2 years after doing Liberations Local for the year and a half, and then thinking about Romancing the Revolution and all this phrasing of like, what does it take to get free, and how do we stay connected to that process? It's a learning process for sure. I know that that's true, but there is like, I don't know, like the biggest lesson that I have learned, that I reiterate over and over and over again, it becomes redundant, but when it comes to liberation, I think that I landed again in all these reflections this past like week on the such valuable importance of doing the thing that you are most perfectly situated to do because of who you are, because of your experience, because of your location within systems. This is like the core and the heart of what I think about with abundance and responsibility. So these things go together, right? If I were to be like, what's the map? for how I think we can make sense of what we do, it would be a connection between love, freedom, responsibility, power, always, and abundance. Like, makes all of this possible, but we only get to a place of abundance when we're not trying to spread ourselves too thin. And when we move with the collective or join the school of dolphins or understand our position as being like in concert with others, where there is, like was articulated in Undrowned, like this ability to kind of step into your role without having to prove anything or assume you need to do what others do or have them do what you do. There's a natural fluidity and a greater diversity and like much more comprehensiveness in terms of what can be done when we are really attuned to what is ours to do. And then you do that to your most with your best ability. You learn in the process with a kind of loving commitment to always embody that whatever is yours to do more fully. And you do it right where you are situated to have the greatest amount of impact by, like speaking, doing, practicing, creating for the purpose of oneself or another's healing, transformation, liberation. It's learning, it's loving, and that is like the whole thing. So the model, again, that I have returned to once more, always, is that like in all of this, even when it comes to liberatory leadership, it's not just like going to, it would be fucked, honestly, if we were like, now we have a credentialing process, a program that will give you a certification or a master's degree in liberatory leadership. Like, do we have to? I hope not. But we're probably gonna do that. It probably already exists. But more importantly, like, I feel like part of the liberatory part of that is that, yes, embodying the values of it, but knowing how to be you, how to do you. So I want to pull this in because, again, like, if you need hope or if you need a perspective to say, like, how are we gonna get through this time? I think one of the most incredible things we can do is actually look for and then, if nothing else, just respect. Respect the work that people are doing when it's obvious, it is so clear that they're doing what they can do right where they are from a place of embodying it as authentically and as lovingly and as fully in a kind of practice that is really about like imbuing all of our choices and all of our movement, all of our effort with the keys to liberation. And so it doesn't become this abstract thing. That's why liberation is local was always like, it's possible now. We do it. You, even in the most oppressive, worst, atrocious, violent conditions, we can move from a place of liberation if we know what that looks like. So going through hundreds of pages of applications that are specifically asking the question, how do you do your work from a place, like from a position of liberatory leadership? Even though the language is a little funky and not everybody uses that, and I get it, and that's fine, there are clear examples of people who are doing it, and it is beautiful to see. So where I was going with that is like, if you need hope or you need examples, like study also the people who seemingly are already in the practice of embodying their leadership in a way that demonstrates how to do it. Now, I could put this in like super cut and dry conventional terms, because I've recently been in some pretty deep conversations about like organizational leadership. This has like been the bulk of my professional career, was working with executive and senior leaders, ultimately to help them lead better, to achieve like organizational wide goals of like becoming an equitable workplace or having transformation to be an inclusive space. But what that ultimately really matters is not meeting certain just like quantifiable benchmarks of like the demographics of our employees now are representative of our populations. Maybe that says something, but it doesn't speak to the culture of the organization. And it has been heartbreaking. Now, this is like the cynicism coming in. My experience of working with so many different senior and executive leaders in so many different organizations is actually really disappointing, because there are more examples that I've seen of senior and executive leaders who do not embody the liberatory values of equity, inclusion, certainly not love and learning and liberation. And when that is the case, when the leaders do not embody the values that we are aiming for, it sets the tone for the culture that is like, you cannot avoid a culture that is dissonant with the values that are being so-called pursued. And I hate to say it, but like most initiatives struggle, if not fail, when the leadership does not understand how to embody it, because the culture always overrides any kind of strategy to like become a more equitable or inclusive place. Like you just can't say those words and then magically it happens. You have to literally change and embody it, practice it, and become it. And so yeah, it's in some ways I wish it didn't come up to such a fine point of being like, well, what are the leaders doing? But it actually does kind of come out to a point of being like, well, what are the leaders doing? Because so many of our efforts fumble when we're following leaders who can say the right things but can't be it. Like I often do this like parallel where I compare things to like intimate relationships on an interpersonal scale, because I think it's like, easier to grapple with sometimes. But like in a situation, let's just imagine an intimate partnership of sorts, and there's someone who really, really, really desperately wants, so they say, to be in a healthy, supportive, loving dynamic with another person. They can say all they want that that's their vision and their hope for the potential of some connection with another person. But if they cannot go through the literal required motions and embody the practices that facilitate conditions for that kind of connection to actually be feasible, it's not going to happen. You can want it, and you might even try to do it, but if you're not grounded in the will of learning, practice, embodiment, and all of that that becomes that, you can't just say, I want it, and hope that it arrives. So whether we're talking organizational culture, the leadership matters, whether we're talking in interpersonal, romantic, even like partnerships, intimate interpersonal dynamics, you have to do it or else it won't happen. And so also in terms of movements, I think to me, this translates into like the opening, the pathway forward is that I always emphasize like working from a liberatory framework, because I think that is the only way that this is going to work. If we move from a place of liberation and we build our movements from a place of liberation, which is not just grounded in fighting or destruction, but even the fight itself, the reason for fighting, the reason for resistance. And I'm being very, very intentional here to say like resistance, diversity of tactics, I'm all on board with all of that. So long as the diversity of tactics are grounded in a place of liberation. If they're not, I just feel like we are releasing our energy in ways that feel necessary because they are, but I don't trust that we have the strategic approach if we don't know that it's coming from a place of freedom, love, and liberation first. So that's like my old little talk on like, how do we approach resistance and movements from a place of liberation? Like, I do think it's necessary. That does not mean it's all like holding hands and singing Kumbaya all the time. Just the resistance has to be grounded in a place of liberation. So all blah, 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 blah. All we need to know constantly is what does liberation look and feel like? So, okay. Let me collect myself for a second. This is a lot. How do I weave all of this together? Is there more to weave together? Well, I did have a note here about the sermon. Let's talk about what I learned from the sermon experience. I'm going to be blunt and say that I am not a religious person. I am pretty religious averse and always have been ever since I was a young kid, when I told my parents it's more important for me to be able to stay up really late at night and watch all of the Saturday Night Lives, including like the replays of the old school like SNLs from the 70s and the 80s. I wanted those classics. So I was up every Saturday night till like 1:32 watching the the classic SNL episodes, which meant I couldn't wake up on early in the morning enough for Sunday church service. So that's how I got out of that. Comedy always wins. But I will say that I am not myself a religious person, never have been. And that can be whatever it means. Though, when I was in high school, do you remember like the early internet days when you could like take a personality test or something? Oh, and the internet was so wholesome. I remember I was in high school and I actually took a test of like, if I were to join a church, what kind of church would it be? Maybe I was curious. I grew up around a lot of other religious folk. Like heavily religious people. So in my own curiosity, I do remember that when I took one of those quizzes in like the 90s on 90s internet, the first response was Unitarian Universalist. So at least I'm consistent. No wonder the Unitarians are the places where I found like any kind of religious intersections. So going to the service and being a part of this and seeing it unfold was really beautiful, I will say. There's always this, for me, a conscientious understanding that like religion has been around for a very long time. So something is working there in terms of bringing people together on a regular, consistent basis, having song and music and text and words and lessons that ground people into how to move into their week. Like this is really about guiding people. It's about moving people. You could have a similar kind of experience in any other learning environment, though like most classes we're not singing together. There's something pretty parallel about like starting every class with like the Pledge of Allegiance or like the singing of the national anthem. So like there are certain practices that become embodied, affective, musical, lyrical, messaging that we're shaping our brains. We're shaping how we see the world and how we move through it. So I know religion has influence and there's something there strategically that has been effective for thousands and thousands of years. But what I loved about watching this service come together over last Sunday was that like I was zeroed in and focused on what I needed to do because I was in this panic of how to write the thing that was really hard to write, having my own flashbacks to graduate school, right? But I will say that it was beautiful to see it all come together because, of course, just like any other kind of production, I've talked about this multiple times before. When you have a beautiful team of people who are so skilled and talented working together, collaborating and coordinating their efforts to produce something that requires all of these individual inputs to be so like synchronized that you create something really magnificent. I loved being able to see the whole of the service, much beyond my sermon. And one thing that stood out to me so much is like what diligence and clarity and commitment it requires for someone to be a part of this regular gathering of a congregation and guiding them with spirited messaging and doing so through a lens, in this case, like our Unitarian Church is wonderful at this, with no qualms whatsoever about moving from a place of love with a justice lens. It was really beautiful to see, and I'm grateful for like this influence in our own community so much. And I have deep respect for the people who are part of this community like experience and like the hub of bringing people together. And it just, I mean, there's talent there too. It's a beautiful gift to share, to be able to weave together themes and make it compelling and make it digestible and hit the marks and the notes for a wide variety of audiences. Like there is skillfulness in that too. So I just wanted to say like that's a props to like the group. Reverend Sean was who I was coordinating with for this particular service. And I think that it's made me think a lot about what spiritual leadership also looks like from a place of liberation. Now, I have been quick to say a lot of our people that we know and love and learn from are philosophers, you know? Like, whether or not we'll admit it, many people in the sort of roster of leaders that we know are philosophers, like Fanon, psychiatrist and a philosopher. Angela Davis, a philosopher, yes. And we could go through the list of others who were philosophers, often philosophers and something else too. But I was thinking a lot recently, naturally, about how so many of our great leaders are also spiritual leaders. So whether that comes with the designation of reverend, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, or like Thich Nhat Hanh, who is another influence on me, was a clear influence on bell hooks. The sort of spiritual traditions are also there. So with like, we need the spiritual leaders and the philosophers and the artists. This is my view of like our greatest movement potential. But because I'm not like a religious person, over the past, I will say it's been like 10-ish years, but especially in the past 6, let's just go back to 2020. Things changed, and I have changed so much. And one of the things that I know I'm very comfortable saying now, that's kind of surprising, is that like I do feel like a much more spiritual person than I ever used to say. To me, spiritual kind of sounded a little like woo-woo, like bypassing kind of stuff, where it's like, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual and I believe in the oneness of all. And I don't know, like you can just say it in a way that feels really, I'm not going to finish that sentence. But that never resonated with me. What does resonate for me when I think about spiritual, if people ask about it now, I understand spirituality or spiritual practice to be always trying to move in greater alignment with our values. And I'm very much okay with a spiritual practice being one of development, of progress, of learning. So it doesn't become like a ta-da, and now I'm spiritual. I think that's what feels gross about it sometimes when people say that, because it's like they don it as like a new identity, as like, now I'm a very spiritual person. And so they get all of the adornments and the clothing or whatever, the accoutrement to like project a kind of spirituality. But to me, spirituality is also the process of always learning and living to be in greater alignment with the values that we hope to embody. So I speak a lot, actually, and think a lot in my own way about spirituality, about love, about faith, even, that in ways that maybe seem surprising, maybe to like younger me. But I know, man, 2020 is like here for me right now. It literally was in 2020. I remember this. I could pull up documentation and evidence, but it was 2020. I was in these conversations with a friend. We ended up having like these recorded conversations. There are even YouTube videos of this. This is Sean Waters. We've done Substack lives before. We've done YouTube over Zoom conversations. But even those grew out of what began in 2020, which were phone conversations that he and I were having. I don't know exactly what started it. I know he reached out to me, and maybe he reached out because a lot of people knew I was struggling. So, but I don't know. Who knows why? But he reached out a couple of times, and we ended up having like, I think like 5 or 6 phone calls that were each very long. And I remember having one in particular where I started to tell him about how my notion of faith was really changing and why I felt like such a faithful person now. I was like, this is weird for me to even say, but I do have a lot of faith, and I move with a lot of faith, which feels very spiritual in a way, but I mean it not in this kind of like, again, maybe the way that most people would assume spirituality assumes a kind of like theology. That's not so much the case for me, but spirituality in terms of faith, of trusting that what does not reflect in the realities around us is still true and possible, and I move with it as like a close sense or guide, if you will, to navigate my own choices. Like there's this presence of heart and mind that gets sort of largely embodied in what we might call a faith. It was even in 2020 when I started talking literally to Sean on the phone, and we recorded those conversations about faith itself. So all of this is like, all of it hangs together. Here's what I will follow. I'm going to end this by kind of pulling my own themes together now. Because where I started was about like, oh, maybe I should write. because that was hard, and writing is important. And then I immediately was like, yikes, that feels like a lot, because I already demand a lot of myself and I produce a lot. And so if I now have an extra expectation to write in a way that I know from experience is demanding and can be a difficult process where I clearly have room to grow, I was like, that feels like a lot to put on myself, because here's what I'm thinking. I even started this one being like, why am I doing these lives again? I had the great insight after this sermon experience of being like, wow, writing's important. Maybe I should write more. And I was like, but I'm doing these live updates. Do I need to do them live? Could they just be like a video maybe? I'm doing my pages, which is a different kind of creative outlet and documentation. It's not the same kind of like clear, coherent, critical, really like diligent writing that my professors in grad school taught me how to do. And then I'm also still doing these like in-person spaces too. Like I've got stand-up philosophy coming up in 2 weeks. And then there's Romance and Revolution, which is the in-person but online space. So I was like, okay, I'm doing a lot. What are we doing in the online space, which is like engaging with each other? What are we doing in the in-person space, which is engaging with each other, but I'm showing up with a different kind of offering even in that space, which is very extemporaneous, vocal, nothing's written down. Then I have my pages, which is like I'm still always trying to tap into this like deeper inner voice that I have about those pages. I have not yet still been able to land on exactly what I want that to be or what I imagine it could be. So I'm still in this process of figuring out even the pages and the writing or the drawing, if you will, of what that looks like. Now I'm like, now I need to write more in the most traditional sense, which I have been trying to do on my live updates, you may have noticed. Each of those posts now has like this hour-ish long share out plus the writing that happens, which is why I'm late on publishing it, because that takes time too to write even that. And then there's the live update, which is this process. It's super organic, a little loose, maybe personal, not polished. And I still want to be doing these live updates because the purpose for this is very different from all the other ones. This is me kind of like documenting the process of my process. And while I don't know how this will actually turn out, there's something in me that has the faith that maybe there's something to this process too. So I want to keep doing it, but all of that is like, no wonder I'm tired. That's a lot. It's so much every week. But I mean, that's the learning. That's my learning process right now. So all of that, I'm going to say that's a way to close of like the live journey here. I still want to be tying together my own learning and the process, processing the process here in a way that can, I don't know, show something. I don't bring it up as much now as I used to, I guess. But I was reminded recently by myself that all of this is still also to try to figure out like, what does an epistemology of intimacy look like? How do we learn and know through the relationship of being in relationship with each other? And sometimes that entails like a kind of process with each other, and it involves a kind of sharing that is always in development and process. That's like literally what learning feels like. So as I and maybe you continue to like explore what an epistemology of intimacy means, what the practice is, what it provides us, it makes a whole lot of sense to me that somewhere under the large banner of an epistemology of intimacy is going to be a very large subsection on learning and what learning looks and feels like. And again, where we started, like what loving looks and feels like, and then how we learn together and who we learn from and what we learn and then what that allows us to do. Okay, that's going to be it. That's how I'm going to end this one. So thanks for joining. Thanks for following along if you are. And however, wherever we find each other, I'm so grateful to be in the process with you. It was beautiful to be invited into a space and like this service to join others who are doing their work in such authentic and really wholehearted, loving ways. And it has been a really incredible privilege to be able to read and speak with so many leaders, even in my own state of Colorado, who are doing incredibly important, valuable work and doing it in a way that really embodies like liberatory leadership as well. So I am not only like feeling filled and inspired and heartened by those examples, but more affirmed that it's so possible for us to do really incredible things together when we do it in a way that feels different because we can be different in it. So that's the lesson, that's the learning, that's the loving. Thanks for your support. If you have the will to support this, subscribe, share, or refer me for anything, because on this new moon in Pisces, it's a reset, and it's supposed to help me figure out what I'm doing now related to work, which would be great to figure out. So if you've got any leads, let me know. That is the pathway that I'm pursuing now. What does this look like in terms of work for me moving forward? We're in the process. We'll see. Okay. Thank you so much. Take care. Be good to yourself and others. And we'll see you soon.